You're listening to Podcasting in Professional Services, where you'll hear stories and experiences from business show hosts about using a podcast to grow their firm. I'm your host, John Tyerman. What's up, business podcasters? About 6 months ago, I interviewed some friendly contacts with experienced podcasting about their production workflows, their podcast editing workflows, and since then, that's the first episode that was published on this podcast. If you go back and listen to it, it was actually when this podcast had a different name. And a lot has changed since then. I've interviewed many more podcasters in professional services, and I wanted to just kind of like revisit this topic of podcast editing workflows and share some other clips from some recent guests. So I thought, I went back and forth about, should I go back and update that episode? Should I record a new one? And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to record a new episode and it's going to be its own thing. Here's what you can expect. I'm going to share some updates on how my own production, podcast editing, podcast distribution workflow has changed in the last 6 months. And I'm going to share some perspective from some of the guests who helped influence a lot of the changes that I made. Ryan Willard from the Business of Architecture. He's been podcasting for over 10 years. He and Enoch have built a podcast workflow and a team to support it. So he'll share his perspective on that. Angela Motzi, about 20% of her podcasts are interviews. The other are solo casts. So she shares her perspective on an approach to staying in a flow state when you're recording a monologue, much like I'm doing right now. And Florian Heinrichs is another guest that you'll hear. He's one of the co-hosts of Unbillable Hours, and it's okay to be scrappy and low production. That's Florian's perspective, and he shares an outline of how he produces a 30-minute episode with only an hour on the books with his co-host, Ash. So he gives you a great perspective on what it would be like to launch a minimum viable podcast, something that's really low budget, low effort. And then the other guests that I have, Katie Tolan and Ross Simmons, I wanted to share their perspective, not so much on the production side of the podcast content per se, but everything that happens afterwards, right? So Ross, for example, his mantra is create once, distribute forever. And he recently published a book by the same name. Go check that out. Go buy Ross's book. But I asked Ross how he lives his mantra and how he turns one podcast episode into dozens of different content assets. And then Katie Tolan is one of the rotating hosts of the Amplify podcast for the Association for Accounting Marketing. And she experimented with turning podcast content into blog posts, and she's experimenting with possibly turning a season into an ebook. So she's doing some forward thinking around podcast distribution in professional services. So I think you'll get a lot of value in what each of those guests has to say. But first, this episode is brought to you by Red Cedar Marketing, a podcast marketing partner for professional services firms. Whether you want to grow your existing show or launch a completely new one, we can help. Go to redcedarmarketing.com to learn more or reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. Happy to have a conversation. And speaking of LinkedIn, recently I shared a LinkedIn post that shows a visual of my podcast distribution, podcast editing workflow. So there's a lot of platforms in here, but then there's arrows that kind of show the flow of the content as it's being produced. So for example, everything starts with my podcast distribution workflow. Everything starts with Calendly, right? So I'll reach out to potential guests. I'll say, hi, I'm looking to feature your podcast on my show. I want to highlight the unique aspects of your podcast. Are you interested? Yeah, I'm interested. Okay, here's a Calendly link. And that Calendly link connects to my Riverside.fm studio, right? So that's the location of the calendar event when it pops up on their calendar. That way, when I go into my studio at the time of the recording, the guests, they're right there. They're able to log in. Sometimes there's some technical hiccups with Riverside, and it only works on Chrome. So there are some issues there, but overall, that process has been really smooth, and I've been able to avoid a bunch of scheduling headaches. And then from there, Riverside, once you record all of the content in there, you can format that in a bunch of different ways. You can take clips and use it for vertical video content. Riverside's really great at that. You can put a background. You can brand the video, the long form video. What I like to do is I don't really like editing a whole lot in Riverside. I found that Descript is a little bit easier for editing, a little bit more smooth. So I'll export the full length MP4 file, video file from Riverside, and then I'll import that into Descript where I'll do a bunch of editing. So I'll edit video first in Descript and get a full video file ready. And then I'll bounce that so that it can be uploaded to YouTube. But then from there, what I'll also do is I'll bounce the WAV file, the audio file from Descript, and that then goes either into GarageBand, where I'll do a couple more tweaks to it and get the sound right, balanced right, and then upload it to Buzzsprout. Or there have been some instances where I've exported directly from Descript and then just use that WAV file to upload to Buzzsprout, where it pushes audio content out to podcast platforms like Apple and Spotify. Now, here's where it gets a little interesting. So one aspect of podcast marketing that I think a lot of podcasters, maybe they don't really think about, or it's a little bit too daunting for them, is turning every podcast episode into a blog post and or a newsletter edition. And it's actually a little bit easier than you think, or if you have the right tools and processes in place. Descript gives you a transcript, right? You can also take your audio files. Let's say instead of bouncing a WAV file, you could bounce an MP3 file, upload that to a platform like Whisper.ai, and you get a formatted transcript without the stricken through words like it has in Descript. I don't know, when I've copied and pasted directly out of Descript, I get those stricken words, and sometimes I don't want that, right? So I'll take the final MP3 file and then use that and upload that to Whisper. I'll get a formatted transcript that's a little bit more tight without the filler words in it. And then Whisper, you can also format it to produce a blog post as an output. So I'll do that to get like a blog outline. And then it's kind of a Frankenstein process a little bit, but you take the blog outline, you take quotes from the transcript, and then you go through, and that gets me about 50%, 60% of the way there. And then I will edit that and write that to completion for every blog post. And then once the blog post is live, that makes making the newsletter really easy. If you're listening to this, subscribe to the newsletter. Would love for you to subscribe and let me know what you think. But that's a place where the podcast content gets redistributed and repurposed as well. Okay, so I've been podcasting for about 5 years now, and just with these interviews that I've done, it's just completely transformed my workflow. And that's part of why I'm interviewing these podcasters. They're a few steps ahead of me on my journey. So if I can curate their perspective and share that with you, then I think that should be valuable to you as well. So our first guest clip today is from Ryan Willard. He's a co-host of the Business of Architecture podcast. He recently shared some behind-the-scenes look at one of the most popular podcasts in all of professional services, really. Here's Ryan. Check it out. The Business of Architecture has produced over 500 episodes. And with so many episodes, you've got to have a rock-solid production workflow. Can you take us just a little bit behind the scenes? You're smiling. I'd love to kind of understand, how do you manage guests, prep work, production, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting one getting our workflow up and running. We right now, and this has been through a lot of mistakes and problems. We have an awesome team that helps us do all of this. And the technology now is brilliant. Like Riverside, what a fantastic I mean, I've had my issues with Riverside in the past.
As have I.
But nowadays it's the AI function and the clips that you can produce, and you can edit it in here. Though we don't tend to do that, but you can. And sometimes now I've started actually using Riverside in person with people. I don't know if you've tried this. Actually taking your laptop, bringing a kind of interface with you, and then I'll record the video on Riverside, and then I'll record the sound on Audition, for example.
Yeah.
So that works quite nicely. The workflow now, we have a guy who is amazing, and he's been working with Enoch, I reckon, probably for the best part of 10 years, for a long time. And he takes all of the videos, he edits them, cleans them up. And then we've got Jackie on our team, who's the kind of office superstar. She handles all the kind of internal communications with the Business of Architecture consulting team, and she also manages the whole process of the podcast and makes sure that I get my intros recorded on time. She makes sure that she's the one that collects the bio and the photographs from the guests that we have on. She schedules Enoch and I. She schedules all of our podcasts. She schedules the podcasts that Enoch and I do with each other. If I want to speak to a guest, she'll be the one that reaches out to the guest to bring them onto the show. She'll often liaise with all the PRs. So the PRs, they contact her. She'll show me a list of potential guests, and I get to pick them. It didn't used to be like that. I used to be the one that was reaching out to architects and would ring people up and would plead with them to be on the podcast and try and explain, no, I don't want to talk about buildings, I want to talk about the business side of it. And then I used to do a lot of my own editing, certainly with shorter form micro content. I used to do all of that. I used to love doing all of it as well. It's not the best use of your time. But now we have, the workflow is great because I can do maybe 2 podcasts a week max, and Enoch can do a similar sort of thing, and it just shows up in our calendar. We click on the link and there's a guest there. All the information about the guest is written to the side, and often I've spoken with them 15 minutes beforehand, or I'm already aware of their work or whatever, and then it's easy. I finish the podcast, then Jackie will write an introduction for me, so using the bio, and then I'll go and record that introduction separately, like what you said you were going to do here. And then that asset, the video asset and the audio, gets sent off. These days, I think a lot of the captions and the writing, we use ChatGPT quite a lot to help us clean it up. Again, Jackie's the one who sort of directs a lot of that, and she'll use ChatGPT and to come with a headline. We actually write with a headline. We've recently started working with a copywriter to help with some of the headlines and stuff. And we've tried all sorts of things with headlines, and certainly Enoch and I got a good handle on writing good headlines for a while anyway. But that's quite a big thing, actually, just finding the headline. And then we manage it all. Nowadays, it's all managed inside of Airtable. Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of like, is this piece done? Is this not done? And it's great for me because, I mean, all I do literally is do this, as I just look at my calendar, click on a link, someone presses play, they ask me a question, or I ask them a question, and that's it, and then I'm done. It took a while to find the right people, for sure. And Enoch and I, a few years ago, because we'd been releasing a podcast pretty much every single week, so we never did seasons.
Yeah.
And my advice to people is do seasons. Because you could just like block up a whole load of them and take a bit of a break. But we just went and we just pretty much for the last 10 years or so, it's been almost a podcast every single week.
All right, so big takeaway, every podcaster needs a Jackie on their team. So it sounds like Jackie's a superstar. I think that just goes to show that podcasting is a team sport. You can start scrappy and you can grow over time. I know Ryan made a comment about he recommends doing seasons because the weekly consistency can be a grind at times. But I think that's a key part of their success with the Business of Architecture podcast is that weekly consistency. And they've built a system that allows them to do that. They've built a team that allows them to do that. That is very much a media operation that's going on. So I think that that's something that if you're a podcaster, you can strive to become. It sounds like it took them 10 years to get to the point where they are today. But sometimes you just got to start scrappy, right? And so I think that is a perfect segue into our next guest. Florian Heinrichs is the founder of Client Friendly and the co-host of the Unbillable Hours podcast. Florian and his co-host Ash have some mixed episode types. So sometimes it's like a host, co-hosts back and forth between the two. Sometimes they both have an interview, a guest on for interviews. And in this clip, Florian shares behind the scenes of what his production workflow looks like. It's a great example of what a minimum viable podcast could be if you're in a professional services firm and you just want to get started with something. So here's Florian.
I think that's a good lesson maybe for your listeners here is you can absolutely give this podcast thing a try, especially if you're in professional services. You can make it a super duper overproduced thing of beauty, or you can run it like we run Unbillable Hours, which is just take note of the questions and the discussions you have in your day to day, right? And turn that into a show. And we have weeks where we schedule an hour for recording. Episodes are 30 minutes. And a good production flow might be I write Ash something on Tuesday, or he writes me something on Wednesday. And do we want to discuss this? And then we think about it for the Thursday. And then we use the first 30 minutes of the recording to structure the episode, right? So just so listeners get a... So effectively what it takes out of sort of active work on the diary in the week is the hour on Friday, right? Which if you think about billable hours and experts having no time, that's a very lean setup you can run.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the benefits you have if you are in professional services, because you are so close to the clients and the topics of interest, and you will have a view on those because that's your job, right? In a way. If my business was in producing yogurts or designing cars or like making widgets, whatever, a podcast would be an add-on. In the world I live in, a podcast is just me repeating what I said to a client last Thursday, just, refined for the public. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you get the idea. I think it's the best, sometimes like the best, leanest way of producing any type of content for professional services.
The best, leanest way of producing any kind of content for professional services. I think that was a great clip from Florian because he highlights another key point in that you're already having these conversations with clients. If you record them, instead of having those conversations, you could send them a link to listen to that conversation so that they can get up to speed with your thinking before they have a more productive conversation with you. Florian also talks about the lean setup that he and Ash have, where they go back and forth on ideas early in the week, and then they schedule an hour on Fridays to record a half an hour podcast episode. So that's very lean setup. But I think I would recommend going back and listening to the full conversation with Florian. So he brings up a lot of really great points, especially about professional services marketing. So go back and listen to that one if you want to hear more from Florian. All right. Our next guest is Angela Mazzi, who is a principal and senior medical planner at GBBN Architects. And she also hosts the Architecting podcast. Now, I recommend you go back and listen to Angela's, that conversation with Angela as well. But again, about 20% of her episodes are interview-based. The rest are monologues. And so Angela shares some perspective and advice for podcasters who are using these solo episode typologies. And she talks about getting into a flow state with your podcasting and how you shouldn't try to edit while you record. My hands up, I'm guilty of doing that sometimes. So I am trying to take Angela's advice actually while I'm recording this podcast and being a little bit more long-winded and trying to resist hitting that space bar button to stop the recording. But anyways, here's what Angela has to say. I think you'll find it valuable.
Angela,
Going back to your podcast, at the time of this recording right now, the Architecting Podcast has published over 230 episodes. So that is quite impressive. To deliver on a weekly cadence like that, you must have a solid production workflow. What does that look like? Can you take us behind the scenes? How are you able to deliver on episodes like that each week?
Oh, I love that you asked that because I am a very spontaneous person. I'm not a planner, which is maybe kind of counterintuitive because my title is medical planner, but I hate planning. I love being intuitive. I love feeling into things. So about 20% of the episodes are interviews, which those are scheduled ahead of time. The others I do as solo casts, and much of the time I sit down and I say, what do I feel like talking about? And it may be a recent experience that made an impression, either good or bad on me. It might be an article that I wrote. It might be a suggestion that came in from the audience. And at first, I took a podcast class before launching the podcast, and it was recommended that you have an outline for your episode. So I did that. And especially that first episode, I felt so much pressure because I needed to set the scene and really, tell you what this podcast was about and show you who I was. And it was all written, right? And now I literally just talk. And what I've noticed, just a little tip with podcasting, is never hit stop, just talk, because you can always edit it later. And if you stop, you lose the flow of your thinking. So I really do just get on there and talk. And I shoot for about 20 to 30-minute episodes because I find that's about the length of time most people care to listen. Longer, they tend to drop off if you look at the listen rates. Yeah. So I do the episodes about that length of time, and I've done it enough now that I have a sense of how long that really is to talk. And I will say it takes twice as long to edit as it does to record, sometimes more, because you got to keep listening and going back and filtering and maybe taking something out or saying, oh, I wanted to link those 2 points. So then you go record another sentence and stick it in the middle. But that's really been my process. And I know a lot of people will outsource editing. I couldn't imagine doing that because I don't know how somebody else would know what I really want to get across. So I love doing my own editing.
And if you love doing your own editing, sometimes a podcast can be a labor of love because it can be time consuming. Angela points out that it takes about twice as long to edit a podcast as it does to record one. And that's kind of been my experience over the last 5 years, is it does take that. That's been validated by a few different people that I've talked to. So if you have a half an hour, if you have a 30-minute conversation that you need to edit down to, let's say, 20 minutes, and that can take about an hour at a time. So Angela talks about not hitting stop so that you don't lose that flow state of thinking. Those are wise words. So if you're just getting started with podcasting, think about recording some long form content before you really start to edit it down. All right, so our next guest is Katie Tolan, growth and profitability consultant for CPAs and one of the rotating hosts of the Amplify podcast for the Association for Accounting Marketing. Now, the Amplify podcast has evolved over time. They tried to do periodic episodes at a certain frequency, but they were having trouble with that. And so they changed and structured their podcast to have seasons where they release a batch of about 6 to 8 episodes a few times each year. So in this clip, Katie shares her perspective on why the expectations of running a podcast, are you willing to commit the time to it? And then she explores different ways that you can take that podcast content and get it in front of your audience in different formats like blog posts and ebooks. So here's Katie.
I think, as we increase our listener and we are providing more value to people, we get a bigger piece of the budget. So, we've gone back and we said we need to outsource the production. If we want to have any sort of regular consistency to this, we can't leave it to a volunteer who suddenly has time to go put these episodes together and push them back. And so we were able to get budget dollars for that. Where the podcast that I did, and I did on business development, and I'm pretty savvy about this topic, I like to think, but I got off of each recording and was like, wow, we had smart people share incredibly smart stuff. And every time I did this, I was like, what are we doing with all this content? Like, there's a boatload of content out here. How do we, not every member listens, not everyone in the accounting industry listens. How do we get this out to more people in a format they might want it? And so, I, for giggles, took every episode I did and I transcribed them, uploaded in transcription service. Mm-hmm. We had over 48,000 words. I'm like, that's bigger than an ebook. Like, that's on your way to like a short book. So how do we do something with this? So I actually turned them all into blog posts where I said, here's what the takeaways from each of the audience members were. We're actually talking as an association on how do we turn this into something else, a checklist, a guide, an ebook, a whatever, now that we have all this great content to get it in the hands of other people. And I think that's what's incredibly great about the podcast and just all the stuff that you learn is even when you have somebody who thinks that, I know some stuff, you don't. Like, there's really smart people or just good reminders of stuff maybe you need to know. That's so how do you take that and get it out to the wider masses? And I think that's something podcasters everywhere struggle with.
I think Katie's absolutely right. That is something that podcasters everywhere absolutely struggle with because once you hit publish, or once you schedule an episode, that's just it's not the finish line, that's the starting line. Because then you need to get that episode into the ears of your target listeners. Well, not everyone listens to a podcast. So how can you take the ideas from the podcast and repackage them in different ways so that your audience can consume them in the formats they prefer? Whether that's reading a blog post, whether that's digesting a newsletter, whether that's looking at an ebook, whether that's looking at short form video on LinkedIn or Twitter or TikTok or Instagram. So there's a number of different channels that your buyers can consume information. And so I think that's exactly kind of why podcast distribution is so important. And which is why I wanted to share this last and final clip with you. Ross Simmons is the founder of Foundation Marketing and host of the Create Like the Greats podcast. His mantra, create once, distribute forever, is just kind of etched in my brain. I've been following Ross for almost a decade now. And in this clip, Ross shares his own podcast distribution workflow, not the production workflow, but the marketing of each podcast episode. And this clip might get a little technical, but I think it's worth it. If you want to accelerate your show's growth, pay attention to what Ross has to say. Here's Ross.
The way that we think about it is once the episode is created, we have an asset. And every time you have an asset, you want to get ROI out of it. And I'm talking like good old-fashioned finance business terms here, but that's essentially the way that we think of it. We've invested in this asset. It required time to create. Now we need to use it to get as much dividends as possible. And the way that we do that is simple. We now have an audio file. And if it is one that actually takes off, we're going to turn it into a video. We're actually going to find ways to turn that into a video asset, either with myself saying the audio all over again, or we're going to use that video file and we're going to upload it to YouTube. Or what we have done in the past, we will bring in an animator to create an animated graphic around the story that was told. We did this with one episode that broke down the success of the website masterclass, and it now lives on YouTube with a fully animated experience. Now, that's not where it ends. We also look and see what are the moments within this podcast episode that might have really resonated with people the most. Then we start to cut those up into short clips. Those clips are going to be reshared on social media. We're going to turn them into reels for Instagram. We're going to turn them into shorts for YouTube. We're going to turn them into vertical videos for TikTok. And then we're going to circulate those. They all go into a Google Drive that are labeled for their different specs and their formats. And then our team goes and starts to create copy that goes with the different types of video assets. And those start to get scheduled to be shared over the course of the next few months. As those pieces are being shared and distributed, ideally, people are then clicking a link in the bio, which are driving them down to create like the greats. They're listening to the podcast, they're consuming it, and they're liking it. They're smashing that subscribe button, and then they're getting more of our content in the future. All that said, we also have emails that go out that would amplify that podcast. So as soon as it goes live, it's going out to our mailing list. I have a link in my signature for every email that I says that actually says subscribe to Create Like the Greats. So everybody's getting that. Check out our latest episode. Our email newsletters are going out to thousands of people 3 times a week. It's promoting the latest episode of Create Like the Greats. I'm taking it and sharing it on my own personal social media account. So it's going out on LinkedIn. It's going up on my Instagram account. And it's probably even going into a few niche communities where my audience are spending time. So if my audience is within a certain Slack group, I might go into that Slack group and say, hey, folks, I just launched a new episode about this topic. Check it out. I think you're going to get a lot of value out of it. And then something interesting starts to happen when the community starts to take that content and share it on their own accounts. That's when you know you have a hit. So at this point, a lot of marketers, creators, podcast hosts, et cetera, would be like, okay, I'm exhausted. And I'd say, yes, you're right. You should be. And I hope you drink a lot of coffee like I do, because it makes it easier to do this stuff. But if you don't, then all you have to do is actually focus on one channel and do the playbook for that. Go on one channel, distribute your content there. Just doing that over and over and over again is more likely to find success than what most people do, which is they press publish, they share it on LinkedIn once, and then they move on to the next episode.
I've been guilty of that too. And Ross is really kind of pressing on a button that a lot of marketers kind of struggle with, is they feel pressure to create more content, and they don't do a good enough job distributing the content that they create originally. So I think Ross's first of all, his distribution workflow is great. The behind the scenes look there was amazing. But I think his advice on focusing on mastering one channel at a time is great, because it can get overwhelming if you don't have the right processes in place to handle multiple channels. He's a master of repurposing content across channels. So I recommend going back and listening to that full conversation with Ross, because he drops a lot of really great advice in that episode. So, all right, those are my guests. That's the perspective that I was able to curate for you for your podcast editing and podcast distribution workflows. They're related, but they're different. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope that it provided some level of value from you. We explored everything from production all the way through distribution. If you made it this far, thank you so much for listening. Please give the podcast a rating, a review, subscribe to the show, and we'll see you next week. Happy podcasting.